哪里去找明镜中？
In 1936, Frank Dawn drew a map of Beijing, so full of life that you can almost taste the dust between your teeth.
Camels are still walking in the streets. The city wall is still standing, but things had changed.
The Dawn map is in reality a portrait of a city in the middle of a gigantic transformation.
The city of Beijing was not called Beijing anymore, but Beiping, because the capital had been moved down to Nanjing.
And the arrival of the rickshaw, this primitive mean of transportation, had sped up the pace of life considerably. And the industrial beast of the locomotive was connecting Beijing with the rest of China and the world beyond.
We have used Frank Dawn's map to tell the story of 12 people, both Chinese and Americans, that all left deep traces in the development of modern Beijing. Because the Frank Dawn map is not only a fascinating glimpse into old Beijing, it is also a testament to early Chinese-American relations.
This is the legation quarter, and it was right over here that Anson Burlingame in 1862 opened the very first diplomatic representation of the US in Beijing. Sadly, there is nothing left of the building today.
Anson Burlingame was an old-school Republican who detested colonialism. This made the Qing government ask him to shift tables and become their representative in 1868. Burlingame would, as a special envoy, lead a Chinese delegation to the US to negotiate the first equal treaty signed by China after the Opium Wars.
Burlingame's residence was rather small, but that would change in 1903. Because in that year, this compound was constructed and the American representation would now be among the largest in all of Beijing.
Many projects and institutions developed because of the Chinese-American relations.
A prominent example of that is the Peking Union Medical College here behind me. This hospital with affiliated medical school is active to this day.
When the Peking Union Medical College opened in 1921, funded by the Rockefeller Foundation, Ida Pruitt was chosen to head the first medical social service department at a Chinese hospital. Pruitt was one of the many Americans that were born in China. She spoke Chinese like a native and became an important bridge between two different cultures.
A curious omission in the Dawn map is the Tsinghua University. Liang Zicheng, Lin Huiyin, Hu Shi, and many others, they all studied in the US supported by the US boxer indemnities. The first students of this study abroad program, they passed their examinations in this little hutong down here in 1909.
One of the first Chinese students was the eminent scholar Hu Shi. While studying in the US, Hu Shi was inspired to advocate for a Chinese language reform, and this would make him a champion of the May 4th movement of 1919.
Hu Shi would, after he returned to China, promote opening up libraries all over the country. And when a second installment of the Boxer indemnities were allocated to make a state-of-the-art national library in the heart of Beijing, he was at the forefront of the project.
When Don created his map, he had help from L.C. Arlington, a fellow American and writer of the famous book In Search of Old Peking. Arlington spent 70 years in China, and his book is almost a key to understand many of the curious descriptions in the Dawn map.
There is, for example, a place just south of the southeast corner tower where it just says Pigeon Thieves.
This is due to the fact that clever locals would raise pigeons to fly up to the imperial granaries.
And at these massive storehouses that still stand in Beijing to this day, they would eat off the grain, fly back and empty out their stomachs in front of their masters.
But who was Frank Dawn, this mysterious mapmaker? Growing up in the Bay Area, Frank Dawn had at an early age been exposed to the Chinatown of San Francisco, and gradually he became more and more drawn to China. Young Frank Dawn was a talented painter, but his family did not approve, so instead Frank Dawn became a Chinese language officer.
This is Dongzongbu Hutong, the street where Frank Dawn lived from 1934 to 1939. If you take a photo and compare it with what is left of Frank Dawn's house today, it becomes a portal back to a time where Beijing was in a limbo between dynasty and republic. The creative bug never left Frank Dawn. Inside the spacious garden of his house, he would, together with the first Hollywood star of Chinese origin, Anna May Wong, be working on a movie script. And with Juliette Bredon, he would research the palace archives, preparing a book about the Forbidden City.
Dawn probably passed a young Anna Chan Chanot in his street, a woman that would later become a very important link between China and the US.
Behind the walls of this area, there are a lot of Republican architecture. And when it comes to Chinese-American relations, then this villa is of special interest. Because in 1971, this house had become the Pakistani embassy. And it was in here that Henry Kissinger arrived to prepare the surprise visit of Richard Nixon a year after.
Kissinger would meet with the Chinese leader Zhou Enlai. And interestingly enough, Zhou Enlai also relates to Frank Dawn, because when the Japanese attacked in 1937, Dawn was sent out of Beijing to report on the fighting by the famous commander Joseph Stilwell. It was in this context that Dawn met a very young Zhou Enlai in Hankou in 1938. When the US joined the war, Joseph Stilwell became in charge of the China-Burma-India Theater and made Frank Dawn one of his closest assistants.
In 1945, Frank Dawn left China, never to come back. But back in the US, he published a book about the Forbidden City and a cookbook with Chinese recipes. But his real legacy is the pictorial map of Beijing he drew in 1936.